Hey folks, this is Emily with American Resiliency. I'm here in this unmonetized video to share stories from our fellow Americans who are suffering, recovering, and helping in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton. In this video, you'll hear on-the-ground reports concerning conditions in Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, with inside information regarding Red Cross and major insurance operations. I want to start by thanking my sources for sharing this powerful information with me. My source information is not organized in any electronic document. I have taken precautions to separate and protect your identities. During this video, I'd like us to direct our energy towards Dr. Jim Vitito, towards Jim in the picture here. He's the man behind AIMS. That's the Appalachian Institute for Mountain Studies. Jim is a biocultural hero whose organization preserves the genetic diversity and the biodiversity of the Southeast, including precious heritage strains that could help us move forward. His seed barn and his seed refrigerators were terribly damaged in Helene. The reason I can bring you this point of visualization for direct assistance is our on-the-ground leader, AR community member Derek. Derek and his mutual aid group went into Burnsville, North Carolina on October 2nd. That was very early in the recovery. And let's remember, Hurricane Helene made landfall on September 26th. Derek's mutual aid group was able to deliver aid valued at about $250 in Burnsville, a town where no official organization for aid had yet arrived. What was set up was just people, resilient people who had gotten themselves organized, who already had some supplies and first aid skills to offer, tough mountain and hippie type people who had laid aside some preps. It's worth recognizing that both in this case and in a lot of other places, it was thanks to the already weird that our communities had the resilience that they needed in these increasingly difficult times. Derek and the other people in his mutual aid group spent time connecting while they were in the disaster area. They spent time helping, listening, getting to understand what the needs were on the ground in these still difficult parts of Western North Carolina to access. It's this work of community that Derek continued online after the aid trip that brought the damage to Jim's seed barn to our attention. I will share some of the local documentation that Derek curated for me when bringing me this story in the video description so that you can learn more about Jim, his work, and the devastation to our biocultural heritage that he's worked so hard to preserve. So when Derek got to Burnsville, 6 days after Helene made landfall, I think it's worth stating again, there was no official aid on the ground. Where was the aid on the ground at that time? We have heard many stories of the life and death consequences of the slow relief still struggling to reach the enormous region devastated by the back-to-back storms of Helene and Milton. I have an interesting leak from the Red Cross that on-the-ground deployment was delayed for weeks due to a decision to rely heavily on drone-first immediate aid approach, which means scouting, right? It means people looking at you while you're suffering from far away. And this, folks, is where it starts to get dumb. Because now I don't know, but I don't think they're dropping any Kit Kats from those drones to show people good intentions. It's not even clear to me if those drones were visually recognizable as being connected with an aid operation. People in rural areas are learning that aid is not coming. Let me bring you this story from rural Georgia, about 45 miles southeast of Augusta. From there, I have on-the-ground reporting from AR community member Titus, who tells me the lack of response, the lack of aid seemed like it resulted from breakdowns at every level. Now, Titus, he has a work history as a first responder. So when he tells me that the local fire and police simply weren't out there doing the things, he knows the things that they ought to be doing. And in his small town, he reports that there was no official presence of any organization of any kind for at least 4 days. Well, he could hear that the fire department had their generator on in the station. They didn't even have a sign out front letting people know they could go in and charge their phones or something. And the only time Titus saw the police was guarding stores against looters and escorting linemen through town, not helping people, not checking on people. People were needing water, and the only water available was for sale at the store. And of course, people were glad they could get it, but if you didn't already have cash on hand, you weren't getting water. And of course, I can tell you this is just one of the many stories I've heard from AR folks. And one thing happens in every one of those ground reports that I've heard. The AR folks, they give water. There's been a terrible need for water throughout the disaster impacted region. We'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. But Titus, as a person giving water, his household needed more water by day 4. His wife got a text message through saying that she'd heard the Red Cross would be in Augusta. Now, Augusta, Georgia is a pretty big town, but even there, Titus reports there was only one Red Cross station and that it was up on the north side of town. So if you're coming in from the southeast, getting up to North Augusta was not the short trip one would usually expect. Sufficient aid was simply not available. I think it's worth mentioning again. People who needed supplies needed to buy them, and the only way to buy them was with cash on hand. Laying aside a couple $100s in cash is a good resilience prep. Titus told me he ran across plenty of people in Georgia with nice cars, no water, and no cash. Titus went up to Augusta to get more supplies and because he needed aid for his child who has complex medical needs. I tell you, I feel deeply the pain of the disabled whose suffering in these disasters has been particularly intense. I think about the folks who are struggling to keep the oxygen tanks powered and the people who are reliant on mail service for their medications. There are many people who struggled and are still struggling to survive in the face of low fuel and serious medical needs across the entire dark zone that emerged from Helene in the southeast. So Titus told me his place got power back earlier than most, and his child is all right. But I think about disability, I think about suffering, and it makes me think about the impacts of these storms on Florida. There are so many people with complex medical needs in Florida. So many people who are disabled, elderly, or both. And I have a leak from inside Florida's home insurance. There are a wide swath of communities in Florida's Big Bend that have been declared a total loss. Whole communities, total loss. In North Carolina, communities that were destroyed, we know their names. We hear about Chimney Rock, we hear about Montreat, we hear about many others. We hear their cry of grief. But no one is saying on the national news the names of these communities in Florida. I went there to Big Bend. I was in Manatee County where many places were destroyed in early 2021. My mother-in-law, she took me there because she needed a little help to achieve a big life goal. And I feel blessed that she shared their life experience with me there. I don't know if you've ever been in a real swamp people area where sure there's some tourism development, but it's mostly just people living there, which I think is true for a lot of Manatee County. It's a really interesting American cultural group, the people who live in those swamps around the Gulf, the low density swamp dwelling people. Those communities tend to be really cool. I got to spend some time with that cultural group when I lived in Louisiana too. You know, there's diversity within it, of course. I'm not saying you're the same in Florida and Louisiana, but you got some cultural traits in common. People tend to be real laid back, tight knit, and know how to have a party. And a lot of people fish for a living, so they don't have documentation. You need to get aid. People in these communities who get hit real hard, they lose everything. If I have the strength to keep going on in this investigation, I want to find out their names. These communities in Florida where we don't even hear the cry of grief that they're gone. And what if you do have documentation in Florida? Well, do you have $10,000? And how many $10,000 do you have? Because I have some on the ground reporting from Orlando, where my source writes, my cousins tell me that the wind from Milton blew over a large number of big trees. Apparently, the companies that cut up and remove downed trees are charging $10,000 per tree to remove the downed trees. There were numerous downed trees in my cousin's area, and their neighbors do not have $10,000 per tree to have the trees removed. The city of Orlando is only cutting up the parts of the trees that are in the roadways and then tossing that tree debris into the yards of the tree owners. The rest of the tree just stays in the owner's yards, and the city is not going to remove those trees from people's yards. Apparently, most homeowners' policies have some kind of huge deductible regarding wind related things from hurricanes. So the insurance policies are not going to pay for the removal of the downed trees because the deductible is so high. Because most people are not going to be able to come up with tens of thousands of dollars to have these downed trees removed, it looks like the trees are just going to be left laying in the yards. It sounds to me like the situation is deteriorating as people realize that they are basically screwed financially. I tell you, when I got this report, I was like, I would be screwed financially. 10 grand is a lot of money. And I want us to remember an unusually high percentage of folks in Florida are retired. Many of our elders in Florida do know the climate outlook and they want to get out and they're having a hard time selling. The word has gotten out that the home insurance premiums keep going up. It can be hard to find a buyer. Many of our elders in Florida are living in constant stress, worried about how will they pay the insurance premiums on their homes next year. This is all catastrophic to a person on a fixed budget, a person who has managed well and provided all their life. Both emotionally and financially, it's catastrophic. It takes a long time to make an extra 10K as a greeter at Walmart, if you can get the job. And 10K isn't even the beginning of a starting point when we consider regional financial damage. We're starting to get some estimates for the regional financial damage, thanks to Tammy for her continuing study and source provision of financial implications of these disasters. Tammy's got the Financial Times quoted as 36 billions in payouts estimated from private insurance alone. And please note, that 36 billion is not going to include any payouts from the National Flood Insurance Program. It doesn't include any payouts from FEMA, and it doesn't include the cost to rebuild infrastructure. So 36 billion is like a very low-end fractional starting point for the recovery. People's homes weren't the only part of the built environment that was damaged. Infrastructure was damaged, businesses were damaged, everything was damaged. There are many thousands of people who have lost their homes and their livelihoods. Some of these folks born in America, families been in America for many generations, are not particularly well documented people. A lot of working poor people, particularly working poor people who work with the land and the sea, don't always have the kind of paperwork you need to get help. Those are the people, the hardworking American citizens who have lost everything. People are going to have to move because many communities were so damaged, they're not going to have normal opportunities for people to work for a while. The small businesses, of course, the family businesses are the ones where it can be hard to say if it's possible to come back. And that can take the pride out of a person, losing their business in a different way from losing their home. And that Tammy, she's always on the ball with financial information. She sent me an update the day of shooting, just this morning, that the SBA, the Small Business Administration, is out of money. So these business owners are not getting loans unless they already applied yesterday. She told me that the Washington Post, it's being reported Congress has decided not to come back into session to address this issue either. Maybe Congress will give the SBA more money in November. How many business owners, not just their families, but also their teams, could handle another month with no income after this disaster? There are good people out there emptying their deepest reserves to keep paying their workers, and there are good people out there whose reserves are already gone. This is so serious on the level of homes, on the level of infrastructure, on the level of the small businesses that keep communities beating. We're talking about a financial disaster on a scale where anyone should be able to say, this is not sustainable. This is going to bleed, and it's not going to be the last disaster on this scale. I want to talk more about the implications of that in a minute, but we're still bleeding. Our countrymen have now suffered through unseasonable cold following the hurricanes. And in Georgia, since the hurricanes, they've gone right back into drought too. The chaotic conditions are destroying their crops, including experimental varieties. I've heard from several people in the AR community who had coffee or cocoa growing that they'd been nursing along, and they all have found the loss of their trees very painful. You know, that was their hope they were nurturing, their hope for the future. Here's the voice from the ground. Here's what an experienced grower wrote me. We haven't had rain since Helene, except for one day, I think, and it wasn't more than being spit on. It's like what you were talking about in your video about Uganda. from drought to deluge. Here, too. We got an early cold snap that lasted about 2 weeks, and now we are forecast to get in the mid 80s this week, which means cold weather crops like broccoli and onions will bolt. Anyone who grows is going to read those conditions, including the temperature swings, and be just inclined to throw up your hands in despair for a moment. It's hard to keep going. These are conditions across the region that threaten to induce despair. And in North Carolina, the ongoing disaster is causing deaths of despair. AR community member Corey has shared this communication from the tracker school, which came through before that cold snap. So this was before it got really cold that we got this news that they had recently received a call for help from one of our former caretakers, Scotty Clay, who's currently in North Carolina assisting with the recovery efforts from Hurricane Helene. Scotty reports that not only is the situation so much worse than imaginable, but the weather is now growing quickly colder. Displaced folks are already facing cold nights, and rescuers worry that morale will quickly tank. They are expecting snow in the next day or two. They already have 12 deaths confirmed as of last night due to hypothermia, 2 of which were children. Scotty reached out asking us to put out a plea to the greater tracker community, asking if there are any folks, ideally those already in North Carolina or a nearby vicinity, who would be willing to volunteer their time to teach some basic survival skills. Basic survival skills. Baby, I want to tell you right here, do not despair. You can get ready. You don't got to freeze to death on the side of a mountain in America. You put a space blanket in your go bag. They cost like $4 and they save your life. And if it turns out we are overreacting and everything is fine, you can be a robot ghost for Halloween next year. But we know it's not fine, right? We know it's not fine. People are dying. I thought Katrina was the worst things could be. I was in that one in the recovery. That was bad times. I've had to confront that I was so wrong about Katrina being the worst. This disaster is a Katrina deep and a culture wide. I feel like the reality of the size of the resilience challenge facing the Southeast is now on all of our minds. Let's get back to implications. There are plenty of us who are not in it, and we should be trying to keep our heads in the game. Focus on that seed bank. If you think conventional agriculture is going to do so great in all of this, you ought to be aware that you're out of your mind. I've talked to all kinds of fancy people who are getting money about these climate issues, and they have absolutely no idea how agriculture works. Some of the big money guys do, but a lot of your tech and entertainment climate figures are like, maybe one time they grew a tomato and it was a spiritual journey. If you are a fortunate person who happens to already be placed in one of these wonderful areas that is blue on the map, I think your personal injury freakout level from global climate change, taking a global perspective, your level of personal threat should be set at like a hip teal. Like most of us in the US are not in a position where we need to be freaking out like actually severely impacted countries. Most of us, if you're in that blue area, you can probably expect to enjoy a relatively slow collapse where the food you can buy gets worse and more expensive because we live right in the heart of the empire. I mean, really, folks. Don't you get it, folks? How much of the framing on climate is deceptive to make us think that we are the victims, to mire us in guilt and shame? That framing makes us weak. That framing keeps us looking inward, worried about our emotions, instead of doing the work on the ground. And if you control land in this big, tolerable region, if you have roots and family in this land, you should be grateful for how you are placed and you should get to work. It's getting hotter. The Seed Genetics Gym has created aims to preserve, to be a mission that will outlast his stewardship and benefit our living future, are already needed further north than they've ever been before. And we never know what heritage strains prized for their other characteristics will turn out to be remarkably heat and drought tolerant. I wanted to share about this heritage pea, the Swenson Swedish, that I originally got from Seed Savers Exchange, a wonderful nonprofit based in Iowa. I grow and preserve the seeds from Swenson Swedish now every year, year to year, and it keeps the taste of spring that I remember from my childhood on the table. Even though the snow peas my family used to grow, they just can't produce anymore with the big temperature swings that we see in spring today. And who would have thought a variety with this name, a variety that invokes Sweden, would be heat and drought resistant? You never know what strain is going to be the one you need. Growing food doesn't have to be a survivalist all in one chicken fried nightmare. It can be a way to blunt the edge, to engage more fully and joyfully with life. The act of preserving heritage strains is not just a love letter to the future, it's a mission worth taking up today. I think seed saving is one important way to approach resilience. I would say that I recommend part of everyone's personal practice every day should be to directly nurture life in some way. But think back to the lack of aid on the ground. Think about who was helping when disaster hit. Even in the cities, there wasn't enough aid. Think about Augusta, Georgia, on day 5 with one Red Cross station. Think about the people this week who can't have their surgery and must suffer longer because of the nationwide shortage of IV fluids. That is just one echoing nationwide result of this ongoing regional disaster. Think about a bunch of young people in a truck just trying to do good. All over the devastated region, it was the American people who gave aid through direct action, and the most important givers of aid were those who were already in place. Most of the AR folks I spoke to who were in the path of the storm were out of water by day 4 or 5 and had to go resupply. That need to resupply to a household was on account of having given water to their neighbors. These acts of kindness, these acts of giving allowed more households to stay in place until the roads were clearer and it was safer to travel. We neglect water storage in temperate environments. You know that we do. I bet that someone out there is feeling a little recognition. As a group, we do neglect water storage in temperate environments. Every one of our households, though, this should be a wake-up call that we can become more resilient so that we can give, so that we can stand with dignity. And when we're in a position where we must receive, as to all of us, those days do come, we can receive knowing we are in community. That's a thing that we can still have in a future where much will be lost. I'm updating my video on recommended household preps for 2025 in the next couple of weeks. These are the good days. They're still the good days, and we should make them count. I want to take a minute to close out our focus on Jim and his seed barn. If you feel moved to give financially this week, I would highly recommend giving directly to Jim's 501c3 organization. And I'll give more details about that in the end cap for anyone who's just listening in. But I think that there are gifts as important as financial gifts. And I believe in the power of prayer. This has been a bad time of year for sleeping seeds, for cold sleeping seeds to experience a thaw. And I want to pray for Jim's seeds that were woke or damaged in this catastrophe. I want to pray for a miracle of life for those seeds, that they should be sleeping peacefully, that they'll wake powerfully and undisturbed and in their season. I can't tell you these stories and wear a mask. I'm here to teach you what I can about the science, but I can't behave like a scientist is supposed to and keep all the parts of myself separate. I know that what we're doing here matters. And speaking, though, of ongoing disasters, this is a small personal update. We have more information for my husband. The news is not so bad as it could be. He may get well. It is entirely possible he will get well, but I am told to expect it will be a long time. Outcomes are uncertain, and many outcomes are possible. That is okay. I know enough now that I can chart a path forward, and I know I can keep going, accepting uncertainty and taking up what threads of hope I can find. That's all anyone can do now. We can do that while cultivating deep resilience, inside and out. Let's get ready. Oh, folks, that was a wild one. Thanks for sticking with me. It's hard times, man. And I know that I don't have anything from South Carolina, and I know South Carolina, they like got the floor wiped with it. So please forgive me. It's not an omission out of disdain, it's an omission. I don't have a direct source for South Carolina. Talking about our community giving this week, it should not surprise you that Jim doesn't have like a streamlined giving operation because he's focused on the seeds. He needs people to email him. He says, please email J.R. Vetito, JRVETETO at gmail.com if you're interested in making a tax deductible donation to Ames. I think it's probably going to take Jim a little while to get back to everybody, but because he's doing a property rebuild, it makes sense for him to have a chance to talk with you and organize the aid that he needs, both financially and in terms of labor. Jim is a person who has been on my professional periphery for many years. His operation is legitimate. He is a biocultural hero. His work absolutely deserves a complete focus of our community's support this week. Thanks for listening in. I will be back with less emotionally intense programming soon. Thanks for getting ready with me, and I'll talk with you again soon.